So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to see this many people wanting to learn more about the polar regions. It hasn't always been that way, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to also thank Lynn for helping with all of the organization and everybody else at the library for the invitation. I remember when I first came last year, the first time I had ever been in the Olin Library, it'll make me emotional. I saw a poster for the Chats and the Stacks, and I thought, wow, wouldn't that be amazing to give a talk at the library? And here we are talking about governing the North American Arctic. I also want to thank Cornell's librarians and archivists. Over the course of my time here last year, I looked at about 30 collections in the archives, and so they had to put up with a lot of questions, a lot of queries, and when I find something exciting, I have a hard time containing myself, so you'd often find me bouncing up to the archivists, telling them stories, so they had to deal with a lot of enthusiasm, so thank you to everybody downstairs. And I also want to thank all of you guys for coming. I know that it's probably been a long term, which is almost over, so it's really great to see so many of you guys here. It's great to also be back at Cornell, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about my book, Governing the North American Arctic. And it's not going to be a strictly kind of academic talk. Mostly I want to tell stories of how this book came to be, what my contribution to the book was, and then how this kind of fits into Cornell's history, because there's actually quite a long and exciting history of Cornell in the Arctic that not a lot of people know about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So I'm going to repeat myself now and tell you where I'm going with this talk. One sec. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about governing the North American Arctic. Like I said, my contribution, which was on Greenland and Arctic security, particularly in terms of American foreign policy. Then some of Cornell's connection to the Arctic tied back to some of the things that I talked about in my article. And then highlight a few of the contemporary challenges to Arctic governance outside of the sort of hardcore military stuff that we hear about a lot of times in the news. And if anyone has questions or doesn't understand something, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I like interactive talks. It can be quite boring sitting, listening to people drone on for long periods of time, so feel free to interrupt. So, as some of you guys might know, and as you heard sort of in my introduction, I've been working on issues of the polar regions for about 10 years. A little over that, about 12 years. And when I first started working on the Arctic, people would look at me and say, why are you studying that? Why does that matter? Who cares? What are you ever going to do with a history degree on Arctic relations? None of that matters. But over the course of the last decade, a number of things have happened. So we have climate change, which has caused a real sort of refocusing on the polar regions generally. We also had the planting of the Russian flag, which is its own exciting story, which sort of refocused international attentions on the political aspects of the polar regions. And also there's been record high natural resource prices. So all of these things combined together to make it so there's a lot of international interest in the Arctic generally. But when these things were reported, they were often treated as completely unprecedented, that this was the first time there was going to be a real race for the Arctic, that people were going to be rushing up to Greenland and Canada and Alaska and extracting resources, and there was going to be a new Cold War. But a lot of this, both political science scholarship and general media discussions about these things didn't take into context the work of indigenous leaders, historians, anthropologists, politicians, and diplomats who had lived in and worked on the area for centuries. So when we first started thinking about this project, I was working at the University of Oxford. And Oxford's a really interesting place for a lot of reasons. It had a pretty important role in early polar exploration, but after that, it sort of fell off the research agenda of a lot of academics there, largely because Cambridge, as some of you in the room will know, SPRI, the Scott Polar Research Institute, is one of the most world-renowned places for polar research, particularly for the sciences. And research at Oxford was fairly disjointed. But Oxford, as many of you will know, has an internationally renowned reputation for humanities and social sciences. And there's two organizations within Oxford and institutions that are really important in sort of social science research relating to North America. So the first, some of you guys might have heard of this already, is called the Rothermere American Institute, and they style themselves as America's home at Oxford. And it's got a very high public profile because a lot of the Rhodes Scholars who did degrees at Oxford end up constantly contributing back to the RAI, so it's quite well funded, and it has really great research programs. And the other institution is St. Antony's College, and for those of you who don't know, It's the International Relations College, so it's the focus of a number of area studies at the University of Oxford. Neither of these places particularly focused on the Arctic during the period, but there were a number of things that were kind of coming together to raise the awareness of the polar regions at the time. So in 2011, there were two major things happening. One was Canada was going to become the chairman of the Arctic Council, and the second thing is that the United States was going to become the chairman of the Arctic Council next. So they were going to see this shift to North American governance of the Arctic Council. And we ended up approaching several embassies, the Canadian embassy, the American embassy, and the Danish embassy, about what kind of things they would want if we were going to work on a publication. And at the time, the Arctic was back in the news, people were talking about things, but what one of the ambassadors said to me was, I don't want to go to another conference that talks about fish. Fish are very interesting, it really matters, but I don't want to hear about fish anymore. And I also don't want to hear about the Anthropocene. So those people who work on the Arctic and have been to a lot of Arctic conferences, the word that comes up again and again is Anthropocene. There's also a lot of kind of esoteric research on masculinities in the North and these kinds of things. All of it really, really matters, but didn't matter to the embassies that we were meeting with. And what they said was they wanted a focused conference that talked about the issues of governance within the North American Arctic, whatever that meant. And so with this in mind, we started pursuing the North American Arctic Conference, which took place in 2013. So I'll go over a little bit about what we talked about. Here are some images from the conference. You have a very grumpy looking me with, this is James Kraska. He's a legal scholar who works on law of the sea. And it brought together a very small number of people who specifically worked on governance in the polar regions. And several things sort of came out of the discussion that we needed to do in the volume. The first was reconceptualizing the geography of the North American Arctic, which sounds like a pretty bold claim, and I'm going to explain what that means in a second. But basically, it just meant that we needed to start including Greenland in discussions of the North American Arctic, which seems obvious, but I'll explain why it wasn't in a second. The second thing was that we needed to make sure that we're incorporating lots of different voices. One of the problems with Arctic research is that it's very kind of internally focused. So scientists often spoke to themselves, political scientists spoke to themselves, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of cross-pollination between industry leaders, policy, legal scholars, and academics generally. And we also wanted to make sure that there were indigenous voices in the text, so indigenous leaders were also incorporated into the conference. And the other thing that I'm very, very passionate about is including historical context in all of our analysis. One of the things that comes up again and again in my research is that all of these things are new. And for those of you who've heard me talk before, I often use quotes from the Second World War, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and the early 2000s, and all of them say the exact same thing. Like, the Arctic is going to be the next major important region, and these are the reasons why it mattered. But they don't often kind of reflect back on the things that had happened before. So, there we go. So each of the sections in the book included specific geographical areas of North America, so Canada, the United States, and Greenland. And while Canada and the United States may seem like obvious subjects of North America, Greenland has often been excluded from these discussions because of its colonial relationship with Denmark. So I talked a little bit about St. Antony's College and the North American Studies program. When they were first getting that off the ground in about 2008, they had this amazing panel that brought together 10 really famous academics, political scientists mostly, who worked on the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. And they spoke for 3 hours about the definition of North America. And Greenland was never mentioned, not once. So I, in my grad student-y way, put my hand up and I was like, you guys, what about Greenland? And the panel kind of like sits back. And you know when no one really wants to answer a question and everybody gets like a little bit uncomfortable, they kind of all look at each other. And someone eventually said, well, it's geographically North American, but it's politically European, which is interesting because Greenland opted out of the EU in the late 1970s. So it's also interesting because indigenous leaders and indigenous groups in the North American Arctic have seen this as a contiguous space for a long time. So that was an important thing when we were thinking about how to put the volume together. And just to highlight why I think this book matters, the contributors included noted geographers, political scientists, legal scholars, historians, alongside politicians, diplomats, and indigenous leaders. So highlights of the book include introductory remarks by former Canadian Foreign Minister Bill Graham. So does anyone know who that is? So he's kind of like the Canadian Secretary of State, and he was also the Minister of Defense, which is basically the Canadian equivalent of what Colin Powell was. So here you see him hanging out with Colin Powell. And the other person who I think is really important and deserves more historical attention is a man named William McGallicook Hensley. Does anyone know who that is? So he was an indigenous leader who was really instrumental in negotiating the Alaskan land deal, Alaskan land claim in the 1960s under Nixon, and he's been a really important part of Alaskan government for a long time. And the most interesting part of the book is the official perspective section, or the part that I find the most interesting. So it's official statements from the American government, the Canadian government, and the Greenlandic government about Arctic governance. And all three of the representatives, just as a side note, working for the Department of Defense right now, I know how very, very difficult it is to get anything cleared through the US government. And so that's part of the reason why this is like a really important thing that it was in our book. All three of the pieces together argued for continued North American Arctic cooperation in terms of governance of spaces. And for those of you who know a lot about this issue, that's sort of a common way of viewing it now, but it was quite outside of the general discussions that were happening at the time. As I said, the American and the Greenlandic contributions were particularly significant. Greenland had just gained fuller autonomy over its land rights in 2009, so it gained control over its mineral rights, subsurface rights. And also in 2013, it had just boycotted an Arctic Council meeting. So that was a big deal. And as I just said, the US does not often publish things outside of official publications, so the fact that Evan Bloom got something through legal was a really big deal. So that is good question. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but this is the one of the images of the Northwest Passage. So I'm going to loop back to this in a little bit, but for those of you who don't know, there's no such thing as a Northwest Passage. It should really be Northwest Passages. And this is an image of the most common routes through the Northwest Passage. So does anyone else have any questions so far? Exciting times, I know. Okay, so there are a handful of my students in this class, and a couple of people who have heard me speak about this before, but my contribution to the book was about Greenland and where it fits in North American Arctic governance more generally, particularly in relation to the United States. It's one of the things I'm most passionate and excited about. So I'm going to try to stay calm and not tell too many exciting stories. But my piece stemmed from the aforementioned discussion, the panel discussion about where Greenland fit. And Greenland's geographical place in North America is really dictated by something that a lot of people don't think about anymore, which is the Monroe Doctrine. How many of the undergrads in this room have studied the Monroe Doctrine? 1, 2, some. Are you guys political scientists? Historians? Generally intelligent people, nice. So for those of you who don't know, the Monroe Doctrine was articulated in 1823 as a way of saying to the world, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. That's in its most simplistic terms. But what I want to point out in terms of Greenland is that the Monroe Doctrine generally only applied to real, tangible security threats to the United States. So in 1823, Greenland was not a tangible security threat to the United States. Does anyone guess why, if you look at this map? So what it says at the top is unexplored. And at the time, and you also see there's two other regions at the bottom, unexplored, unexplored. So Greenland was really hard to get to, and I'm going to loop back again to this in a second. It was far, far away, hard to get to, cold, and dark. And so the idea of incorporating it into the Western Hemisphere was sort of like the idea of incorporating the moon into American foreign policy before the space race, because it really was that far away and that different. So My poor students have suffered greatly through the man pictured here, who is Robert Peary. So he was the person who claimed to be the first person to reach the North Pole. And a lot of people were sort of interested in the polar regions at random times. So for those of you who've heard of William Seward, who did the Alaskan land purchase, around the same time, he also tried to buy Greenland. And so it had long been a part of tangential American foreign policy to get Greenland, get Canada, and eventually the United States would basically cover the entire continent. So Peary he had done a number of expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th century, and as I said, in 1909, he claimed to be the first person to reach the pole. And if you ask, well, why does that matter in a political discussion? The reason it mattered for foreign policy was because those areas were unexplored, Peary could claim exploratory rights to Greenland on behalf of the United States. Now we're going to go to a radically different part of the world. So in 1916, after he had come back from his polar expeditions, Peary launched a major media campaign to prevent the abdication of those rights in order to purchase the Virgin Islands. Does everyone know where the Virgin Islands are? So they're in the Caribbean, quite close to the Panama Canal. And the reason this mattered is the Panama Canal had just opened, and it was radically changing the way that shipping routes and transportation across the world worked, because it opened a whole new way to move things. And so during the First World War, the United States was worried that if they didn't buy the Virgin Islands, the Germans were going to set up a base at St. Thomas and were going to kind of block the Panama Canal. The only way that the Danish would sell the Virgin Islands to the United States is if they abdicated their rights to Greenland, so their territorial claims to Greenland. So there's a big debate about what they should do. And I've gone into Wilson and Lansing's papers, and there's a huge sort of back and forth. And Wilson eventually says, do whatever needs to be done. This is the most important thing. So you prioritize the real security threat rather than the potential of Greenland one day. Because what Peary always would say is, someday Greenland's going to matter. Airplanes are going to be able to fly further. Greenland probably has minerals. Telecommunication cables could go over Greenland. And within 20 years, he was right. So there are three major things that happened that changed the position of Greenland. And the first and very most important was aviation. So just like the Panama Canal opened the rest of the world, or opened shipping routes across the world, aviation changed the way that people moved. And in the interwar period, a lot of you guys will know this already, Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic for the first time, and this fine gentleman, does anyone know who this is? Richard Byrd. He was the first person to fly to the North Pole, and I always feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about these things because Peary probably didn't make it to the North Pole, and Byrd probably also didn't make it to the North Pole, but that's what everybody thought at the time. He also flew back and forth to Greenland a few times, and these sort of public flights sort of captured everybody's imagination and raised the public profile of the polar regions, but also for military planners, the ability to fly to the US from Greenland sort of changed the way that they had to conceptualize American security. And my poor students, this is one of my other favorite things. Does anyone know what this mineral is? Geologists in the crowd? This is a mineral called cryolite, which is used for smelting aluminum. There is only one place in the world you could get it. There was only one mine in Greenland, in Iviktut, and it was 200 meters below sea level. And you couldn't smelt aluminum. It was used in this thing called the Hall-Héroult process of aluminum smelting. You couldn't smelt aluminum without cryolite, and that meant you couldn't make airplanes without cryolite. So that really mattered in the period. And if people want to know about production things or anything else about cryolite, I can tell you all you want to know about it. Mm-hmm.
Are there now alternative ways to make aluminum so that the world's not dependent on its cryolite?
Absolutely. So what happened over the course of the war is they developed a synthetic using fluorite, which is much more readily available. And it was the Aluminum Company of America that helped to develop it. And now China is the #1 world producer of synthetic cryolite. So some of my other presentations show like warehouses full of bags that say synthetic cryolite China. Very exciting. All right. So the last thing that sort of radically changed the position of Greenland was geopolitical instability at the time. I don't need to tell most people in this room that we're living through another moment of geopolitical instability, but at the time we had Japanese expansion in Asia. We also had German expansion in Europe. The Second World War wasn't connected yet, so a lot of people don't really think about things like that, but we had two sort of major geopolitical problems in the world. And the way that the US had always dealt with it, or had said that they always dealt with it, was that the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, would always protect the United States against foreign aggression. But on April 9th, 1940, Germany invaded Denmark, and that meant that the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and most significantly within the Western Hemisphere, Greenland, was suddenly available to be occupied. And if people have more questions about that, I can talk more about it. But the moral of the story for Roosevelt was living in this period of kind of extreme isolationism. He had a real uphill battle trying to increase any kind of military spending. He was hamstrung by a series of neutrality acts, and no matter what he did, he was seen as a sword-rattling warmonger. I love this picture so much. So no one's really there. I don't think historians agree on what Roosevelt was actually trying to do, but one of the things I know he was trying to do was increase our American defense. So the way that he did this, which I really want to tell this story, but I'm going to hold myself back, was he extended the Monroe Doctrine to the Arctic and the Antarctic. So when I started working on this in 2004-ish, I read an article by Lawrence Martin, and that's where two of these things are from. So it's a 1940 article about where the limits of the Western Hemisphere are. And this summer, I was at Roosevelt's archives, and I found his article with Roosevelt's notes on it. And in the article, it says, "This is very important, send to the Secretary of War, send to the Secretary of the Navy." I was literally in the archives with like tears streaming down my face, the poor archivist. But the important thing about this was, this is part of where Roosevelt's idea came from to extend the Monroe Doctrine to Greenland, because it wasn't about sort of getting involved in a war in Europe, it was about defending the country. So if we extend the Monroe Doctrine to Greenland, we can make the Western Hemisphere safe, we're making the US safe. In some ways, it's kind of like discussions about building the wall now, but we'll try not to get into that. Okay. So as a result of this, there's a whole sort of convoluted history of things that happen. Undercover Mounties go to Greenland, the Coast Guard races them, and they block a cryolite mine. But publicly, what happens is in 1941, they sign the Agreement for the Defense of Greenland, which allows the US to establish bases all over the island. And that was augmented in 1951 by another defense agreement, which allowed for the creation of Thule, which is right up there, which is still one of our most significant military bases, and we're going to come back to that in a second.
Who signed the agreement?
Pardon me?
Who signed the agreement?
The United States and Denmark.
So Canada wasn't involved.
Canada's a whole nother talk, but we can talk about it later. It's exciting times. So I was working on all these edits and doing all this book stuff when I first came to Cornell, and I was like, oh wow, I wonder what they have in the archives. So I started doing all these searches, Greenland, Arctic, Alaska, blah, blah, blah. And I found that Cornellians actually played quite a big role in the development of the things that happened in Greenland. So I'm just gonna highlight a few of them and highlight some exciting characters from around campus. But before World War I, they were scientific and financial and expeditionary support for Peary's claim. They also helped with technological support in the development of aviation. And finally, in the Cold War, they were part of the people who helped develop systems theory and infrastructure that ended up lining the North American Arctic in the dew line in the Cold War. So I know that some people know what this is, but has anyone ever noticed this rock before? You guys might know. Does anyone know who it's for? I see some like vague rumblings. So this is from Ralph Stockman Tarr, who was a geologist, and I don't want to say too much about this because Matt Pritchard, who's been working on digitizing some of his images, is in the room right now. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is In general polar historiography, we often think of these polar explorers as working alone and seeing a major break between what they call the heroic period of exploration and scientific work that ends up happening in the 20th century. And I think this person, Ralph Stockman Tarr, is an important example of why that delineation shouldn't happen. He was a really important geologist, one of the founding members of the American Geological Society, and he went with Peary on his 1896 mission. And here's an exciting quote from him. He wrote to his brother after his mission with Peary, and he said, "My trip to Greenland was full of wonder and replete with results. I don't think that a geologist, and especially one working on the glacial aspects of the subject, can afford to miss the opportunity of spending a summer or a month with the Great Glacier." How cool is that? And then I also found this stuff super cool. So has anyone ever heard of Wyckoff Road or been on Wyckoff Road? So it's sort of like a fixture in Ithaca. So Wyckoff brothers, Edward and Clarence, were the heirs to the Remington typewriter fortune, which is essentially like being heirs to IBM or an Apple fortune today. So they were extremely wealthy and they did all sorts of really amazing things in Ithaca. But one of the other things they did was fund Peary's Arctic expedition. So they were a major backer of all of Peary's Arctic expeditions. And we have a lot of these papers in the collection. So you see here, this is Peary Arctic Club. And one of the really cool things is in 1901, Peary didn't come back from an expedition. And so Frederick Cook, one of his partners, went back up to the Arctic to try to find him and brought the Wyckoff brothers with him. There ends up being a huge controversy because Peary probably didn't reach the pole. Cook wanted to publish his results. And there was a big sort of public debate about what should happen and who actually got to the pole first. And the Wyckoff brothers sided with Cook and stopped funding Peary's expeditions. But if people want to know more about that, I can talk about that later. You're not bored, are you? Okay. And then this, when I first found this, I also got super excited, and you'll see why in a second. So for those of you who have been to Sage Chapel, there's a really interesting character named Ross Gilmore Marvin, and you could do a whole talk like just on his life and the memory of how he's commemorated at Cornell. But the plaque in Sage Chapel says, "Marvin had planted the Cornell colors beyond the farthest north of Nansen and Abruzzi. To Ross Gilmore Marvin, 1880 to 1909, Cornell AB 1905, teacher and explorer, drowned in the Arctic Ocean, April 10th, 1909. The students of the university erect this memorial to a brave and honest man." So I won't get too into the story because it's really quite crazy, but he ends up going along with Peary on his 1909 expedition, falls through the ice and dies. So when they come back to Cornell, Peary reads his eulogy. It's this really moving thing. And then in 1925, George Palmer Putnam, who is a New York City publisher and future husband of Amelia Earhart, along with Captain Robert A. Bartlett and Knud Rasmussen, all go to Greenland for a Smithsonian expedition. And when they're there, they meet the two Greenlanders who were with Marvin when he died. And they had both converted to Christianity, and what they said was, "He didn't fall through the ice, we murdered him." So this got into the New York Times. You can see New York Times, September 25th. This was like a major, major story, really interesting. And since then, there's been a lot more work on it, and it's likely that Marvin probably had a mental breakdown on the ice, and they killed him basically in self-defense. But whatever the reasons for it was, whatever the circumstances of Marvin's death were, the library archives here reveal this pivotal role that Cornell played in science, funding, and expeditionary support of Peary's missions. And I love this picture. This is by an artist called Albert Operti, and so these are in the archives. This is an image that he painted of Peary, and if you see, it's Greenland with a nice little American flag in the background. Now, although the memory of Marvin is a little bit sketchy, the kind of furor that happened around his death and all the interest and excitement led the students at Cornell to be quite moved by his memory, and that's part of the reason why they did the plaque. And you guys might recognize this fine gentleman from one of my earlier slides. This is Richard Byrd, polar explorer who flew to the North Pole, or may not have, in 1926. And when I found this, I got super excited because a big part of my Star Spangled Ice is about Richard Byrd and Roosevelt, and I was like, oh, it's all coming back to Cornell. But Cornell has another connection to Richard Byrd, which is that an engineer who's a Cornellian named James Edward Snow was in charge of the lubrication and engine functioning of the Josephine Ford, which is the plane that Byrd flew to the North Pole. So that's the plane, and he was in charge of it. And so what we saw here, I'm trying not to flip so fast, is the radiogram that Byrd sends basically saying, thank you, the gasoline that you helped invent for me worked really well. And yeah, fun time. So he was a member of Phi Delta Theta, and that's their fraternity house. And I was doing a little bit of research into it because I was interested to see sort of what their kind of current reputation is. And apparently it's not a fun house because it's dry, but I'm sure Edward James Snow had a great time while he was there. Okay. So the last Cornellians I want to talk about are people who completely intrigue me, but I can't find out very much about them because all of their work is still classified. A huge portion of their work is still classified. Do these names mean anything to anyone? So they were both fish biologists. And Mottley, in particular, he was one of the pioneers of something called systems theory. So he developed a new way to count fish that was completely revolutionary. During the Second World War, he was drafted, basically, or brought into the Department of Defense to start working on systems theory and systems analysis of global threats, essentially. And so these two together basically developed the program, like they developed the systems theory on early missile warning. So when we talk about ICBMs with Korea right now, the big worry at the time was that Russia was going to develop ICBMs, and they needed a system and a theory that would help protect the United States from any type of ICBM attack. And so this pair of people helped develop the theory and the actual infrastructure of the DEW line. So this is an image of Tula with some of the radars, and the DEW line was basically a giant radio transmission receiver that went all the way across the Arctic, and both Shuck and Mottley were involved in creating it. So we have bits and pieces of their records in the archives, but almost all of their actual technical papers are still classified, which I find really cool. Okay. So why does any of this matter? Back to the questions that people asked me in 2004, 2005. Over the past century, the United States has continually increased its presence in the North American Arctic, but the current administration is sending mixed messages to the international community and the American people about what the role of the US in the world is. And what we often hear about are, there's going to be another Cold War or a rush for resources in the Arctic, but some of the same challenges that we saw in the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War are happening again right now. So issues of technology and climate change, economy and natural resources, and global political flux. So I could talk about the hard military issues that we're going to face, but what I want to think about is some of the other things that we should maybe be thinking outside of the sort of realist problems between powers in the far north. And so we talked a little bit about the Panama Canal and how it changed transportation, and aviation and how it changed transportation. One of the major effects of climate change is that it's going to change transportation in the far north. So we had the question about the Northwest Passage and what it meant. One of the things that they keep saying is it's going to increase shipping in the Northwest Passage, but one of the things that's happening more than shipping is tourism. So some of you might recognize this ship, which is the Crystal Serenity. So it was a mega cruise liner which sailed through the Northwest Passage last summer. Now, there are a whole bunch of issues around that, but from a kind of security governance perspective, one of the things to think about is who's saying where the ships get to go? And can we help rescue people if something happens? So right now, the US only has one functioning icebreaker, and it doesn't have the infrastructure to actually go rescue people. So if part of our way of governing the Arctic is through our ability to control what happens there and rescue people, we don't have that capacity anymore. The other thing is, whether or not this is going to happen or not, China had a proposal last summer to send a cruise ship full of tourists through the Northwest Passage without asking Canada permission, which is similar to what happened with the SS Manhattan in the US in the 60s. But if they did that, it's sort of showing that Canada can't actually control its internal waters. And that's the big debate that's still happening with the Northwest Passage. Is the Northwest Passage Canadian waters, internal waters, or should it be a global kind of thoroughfare? So just some things to think about. And one of my...
Excuse me, what does the Treaty of the Sea say specifically about that?
So UNCLOS has a special thing on the governance of ice-covered areas, and there's still a debate about how far the seafloor goes out. It's quite a complicated question that's still sort of up for debate.
But if the seafloor were the controlling factor,
Mm-hmm.
what would that mean about the seafloor?
So there's a couple of things. It's quite a complicated question because you still have to show effective occupation, and there's a very long history with Canada with some of those islands about whether or not they've effectively controlled their territory. So legally, if the seafloor extends, it should be Canadian waters, but there's still a debate about what that means.
The 200 mile?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ellesmere is definitely included in Canada. Oh, sorry. Okay. So natural resources, the thing that kept coming up again and again is like there's going to be a major Arctic bonanza, there's going to be an exciting time for resources, everybody's going to go there and dig things up. But as the people in my class will know, the Arctic is still far away, cold, and dark. And one of the things that people don't know, has anyone been to Greenland before in the room? Okay, so the person who's been to Greenland will know that there aren't roads that connect towns, and a lot of the infrastructure, even in the Canadian high north, they're ice roads or temporary winter landing strips. So if ice is melting, it actually makes it harder to reach places. And some of you might also know that a lot of the infrastructure that is built, so housing and these kinds of things, is built on permafrost. So as permafrost starts to melt, it kind of messes up what's happening with the Arctic. Now, the thing that I find interesting is what it means when countries back corporations, which brings us to global political flux, which has come up again and again. And as I said before, I don't need to tell you there's a lot going on in the world right now, but in Greenland particularly, you have an increasing polarization between the people in Greenland who want to stay attached to Denmark and people who want full independence at any cost. Full independence at any cost means that they can extract the resources as quickly as possible in order to pay their operating budget, because right now Denmark pays about 50% of Greenland's operating budget. But as we talked about a little while ago, I think, that Greenland's agreement, or our agreement for the defense of Greenland, is actually with Denmark. It's not with Greenland. So if Greenland becomes fully independent, that means our base at Tula and all of the arrangements that allow it to exist there will have to be renegotiated. And the question becomes, as the United States retreats back into itself in a moment of retrenchment, we're really going to have to think about what the limits of the Western Hemisphere and where the lines of American security kind of begin and end, and where Greenland will fit into that. So with that, I'm really excited to answer any questions, and I also want to say thank you to all of the wonderful people who have given me money over the last decade.
So whenever Robert Barry was going to Greenland with the map with an American flag on it and everything, what was Denmark's role in Greenland, and what did they think about that?
So such a good question, super complicated. So I'm gonna have to try to answer this not going back to 1721 or 982. In 1933, the International Court awarded sovereignty of Greenland to Denmark. But before that, Greenland was run by Denmark as a closed-door colony, so you could get special permits to go in and do research and these kinds of things. So the answer to that is they were suspicious. But it's a really complicated question because in the late 19th century, Denmark offered to sell Greenland to the US. They had a whole bill go through Congress, and Congress blocked it. So it passed in Congress and failed in the Senate, I think is what happened. But there's a long history of like the United States almost owning Greenland, and it was really expensive for them to maintain is the other problem. So even right now, Denmark pays 50% of Greenland's base operating budget, and at the time, they were worried about sort of the cost of maintaining all of these colonies. So depending on what was happening in Denmark internally, there was sort of a fight between, do we give up Greenland or do we keep it at any cost? So the answer is, it's complicated. Yes. Sorry.
I think I can speak loudly enough with the microphone.
This is to pick it up for the
sorry.
recording, sorry.
So with climate change, I suppose making permafrost melt and making perhaps more natural resources available, do you think the Denmark government will be less willing to give it up?
So in 2009, Greenlanders voted for increased home rule powers. And so what that meant was that Denmark gave full control over subsurface rights to Greenland, with the idea that as Greenland developed its mineral resources, that they would have to pay less for their operations. And so no is the short answer, because they've already given Greenland back their rights of all minerals and subsurface rights. But Greenland is still slightly under an EU convention of not being able to mine uranium. And so only with full independence from Denmark can Greenland mine uranium. So it's sort of a complicated answer, as everything is. Yeah.
So I haven't heard you talk much about Canada in the whole thing. Canada is not that big in terms of population and means. Has Canada ever been interested in getting Greenland and not being able to because they're not as rich as their southern neighbor, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, so that's an amazing question. That was actually what my dissertation was about. It was on Canada, the US, and Great Britain and how they manage Greenland. And the short answer to has Canada tried to get Greenland, the answer is kind of yes. So when Germany invaded Denmark, the idea of, at the time in Canada, there was a large portion of the government that was liberal and pro-American. You probably know some of this already. And that the other part of the government was conservative and still very pro-British. And the pro-British side, during the war, when Germany invaded Denmark, wanted the Minister of Mines and Resources to occupy Greenland and claim it for Canada. Because the Aluminum Company of Canada, Alcoa, was producing 30% of the world's aluminum and a huge part of the British war effort. So it was really essential to basically Commonwealth security. What ended up happening was a big fight between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Mines and Resources, but the Minister of Mines and Resources ended up putting 8 undercover Mounties on a Hudson Bay mail ship and sending them to Greenland in order to occupy the cryolite mine. Then the Americans found out about it, in particular Cordell Hull, who was the Undersecretary of State, and they raced 3 Coast Guard cutters to beat this ship called the Nescope to Greenland and block the Canadians from going to Greenland. They had to stay there for 2 months and eventually were allowed on board to take some cryolite and go away. So there were parts of the government that wanted Greenland, particularly for this resource. And certain people in Canada thought Greenland was naturally part of Canada. And yeah. So that it was naturally part of Canada, it seems like it should be part of a contiguous territory, but it's complicated, is the moral of the story. That's gonna be my answer for everything. I don't know if that answers it so much, but the history of it is fascinating. Yes.
So how would you describe modern-day U.S. relations with modern-day Greenland? Like, we kind of got like a history there, but how is it right now, specifically?
It's complicated. So when I last talked to I knew the last Greenlandic foreign minister, and part of the reason why the history lesson matters is that in Greenland, it has a very long historical tradition. A lot of their policies are based on history, and when I was talking to him, he said, as far as we're concerned, the Monroe Doctrine still applies to Greenland. That's how they speak about it right now. And so the US doesn't pay, I don't think it necessarily pays as much attention to Greenland as it should. So within Greenland, there's a huge debate amongst Greenlanders as to whether or not having a US base on the island is actually beneficial to Greenlanders. So there's still a lot of animosity towards the Danish, and there's other kinds of animosity towards Americans, and there's a desire to be fully free from either Denmark or the US. Other people think having the US involved is a really good thing because they're suspicious about what China could do given some of the things that China has done in Africa. And so the military relations are generally pretty good, but in terms of foreign policy, it just doesn't feature extremely highly on this administration so far, this administration's agenda. I don't know if that answers your question. Yep.
So what do you see in terms of the future, in particular with the idea of climate change? There are governments that are more pro-conservation, others that are more pro, let's just make money with it. It's still a pristine place and perhaps one of the very important places to take care of. What do you see are the biggest, I just don't have the English word for it, des enjeux? What is the biggest threat and what's at stake for the future?
That's a very big question.
It's complicated.
And it is, that's my answer to everything. To me, and a lot of it is still dictated by what American policymakers' agendas are. And so this administration has not shown a propensity for conservation. And in the region, that's a real problem, whether we're talking about shipping, whether we're talking about mining, whether we're talking about regulation. And that's sort of in the offshore part. I think the Canadian government is still doing quite a good job of managing how it develops industry in the north. Greenland is still also being very careful. It's a slow process of how industry is developing. But my big worry is, for example, if shipping is increased in the Northwest Passage, there's not an effective way, people have heard me say this before, to clean up oil spills in the snow or oil spills under ice. So the normal way that you would clean up an oil spill is you do a controlled burn or you release microbes that help break down the oil and eventually get things back to normal. But from all of the environmental conferences that I've gone to, I've met with some of the people who do these cleanups, and what they say is, for example, in snow, anything oil or any chemicals sink through the snow and spread out so you can't clean it up. And under ice, it goes under the surface of the ice and spreads. And so I think the biggest risk is having some sort of major environmental disaster, and the effects on wildlife would be pretty substantial. The other major risk goes back to something we highlighted a little bit ago, is if there is a mega cruise liner that is in an accident, there could be a major loss of life because we just really don't have the infrastructure to do an effective rescue. We don't have icebreakers, enough icebreakers, we don't have proper infrastructure, and this was one of the things that was talked about when the ship started sailing through. The other thing that some glaciologists might know is that with increased global temperatures, it actually increases the number of icebergs in water, so it increases iceberg calving. And what that means is the Northwest Passage can actually be harder to navigate because of the number of icebergs. So I think there's environmental and human concerns, definitely. And then we haven't even talked about climate refugees, because a lot of the kind of coastal communities are being affected by rising sea level. So it's problematic and complicated.
Last one from me. You cruised through the whole presentation without saying anything about the longest border in the Arctic, meaning Russia.
Because the book is governing the North American Arctic.
However, all along that border, you have implications that will play into all of the subjects that you've covered relative to Canada and Greenland and the likes.
Yep. So part of the reason I didn't talk about Russia is there's a number of people in this room who are much more expert on Russia than I am. But It's also quite a different context. So part of the reason we wrote the book Governing the North American Arctic is the issues that happen in the North American Arctic, there are some that are specific to North America. So a lot of the things that I said about shipping are not true in the Russian context because it has a longer open border and it's easier to ship. So they've already massively increased shipping over the last decade and they're continuing to increase shipping and infrastructure and all of those kinds of things. The other reason is that there's quite a lot of people working on the militarization of the Russian Arctic, and since it wasn't covered in the book, that's part of the reason why I didn't talk about it. But you're right, there's huge implications of all of the things that are happening. And when we talk about environmental consequences, Russia is still doing quite a lot of oil drilling, quite a lot of shipping. Things that happen on the Russian side of the Arctic can easily come to the North American Arctic.
One more question? If not, please join me in thanking Dr. Berry for this time.